So this video is all about how we can reach net zero in the pharmaceutical industry. I am Professor Marloes Peters, and you might know that I have this playlist which is all about bioreactors in the pharmaceutical industry. So today I will not specifically talk about bioreactor design or applications, but I will talk about some of the things that you need to bear in mind, and also when it comes to bioreactors, of how we can be more sustainable. I guess the first question is, what is actually net zero? So you might have come across this term before, or you might have heard things like carbon neutral, but basically it means there needs to be a balance between the carbon emitted into the atmosphere versus the carbon removed. And actually, the UK government and many other governments have set a target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 because they thought that was the earliest they could actually implement this. And the idea behind this is that then there would be 50% chance of avoiding the catastrophic 1.5 degrees temperature rise by the year 2100. But probably if we look at the last couple of years and the exponential rise we've seen in temperatures with record-breaking temperatures almost every year, we're probably much closer to that temperature than we think, and it will probably be reached before the end of the decade. So that's why it's so important to look at this. The things that are important for the general household, so not specifically in the pharmaceutical industry, include, for instance, your heating, mode of transport, electricity, aviation, but also, for instance, our diet and agriculture. So whether you eat meat or whether you're vegetarian does actually make a big difference. But then specifically in the pharmaceutical industry, how can we achieve this net zero? Well, the first thing we can do is just reduce the emissions by, for instance, think about if rather than taking your car, you would cycle somewhere or take public transport. So that's an example of how we reduce the emissions overall. But then the second bit is reusing of waste materials. So, for instance, recycling. And if you want to know more about this concept where we look at the circular economy, where we use materials for as long as possible, then have a look at this video. And then finally, what's getting more and more important, and you'll hear more of, are carbon capture technologies. Because most of the time we can't really avoid having to do certain things. So that means that rather than it going into the atmosphere, we need to capture the carbon. But now let's have a look at net zero specifically in the pharmaceutical industry. So obviously each company might have their individual guidelines and some companies might pay more effort than others. But generally you will also see there are also collective initiatives, particularly when you look at the bigger companies. And I will show an example of that in the next slide. But what are the things you can do? And I think a lot of these things are applicable across industries. The first thing that you really need to do to ensure that your carbon accounting, so how much you emit, is data driven and measurable, because otherwise you have no idea what kind of starting point you are at. So there's, for instance, certain types of software that you can use for this. Then it is important to scope out some key initiatives, because obviously it will be very hard to implement lots of different initiatives at the same time, but to focus on those key initiatives and to implement sustainable procurement. So this is also the things, the raw materials that you're going to use, and you will see later on why that's so important. Then when a strategy is created by management, it's important to see this as an end-to-end solution. So you shouldn't just consider the bioreactor, or you shouldn't just consider the production process, but really you need to look all the way across. So here I mentioned, for instance, packaging, but also procurement and finances, how, for instance, people come to work. All of that are important decisions. Then we need to have a think about, but be practical. So how can you make transitions fast and make them more sustainable? Well, a lot of these companies, obviously, it's still a dollar industry. So the initiatives that will have the highest impact per dollar or cost saving are the ones that will be more important. So that's why for fast implementation, it's worth kind of considering that also from a cost perspective. And then finally, what you really need to make sure of that this is not just an individual effort. So there really should be involvement from senior management to make some key strategic decisions. So for instance, if there would be a company policy on certain things, to make sure that this is implemented all the way across by all employees. And then here is a specific initiative on net zero, which is a joint initiative, so very recently from 2022, by 7 major pharmaceutical companies. So the things they looked at were importantly to look at reducing the carbon in the supply chain. So, in order to set common supplier standards, to transition towards renewable energy, to look at green heat solutions, and also you will see that transportation is very important. So, they looked, for instance, for traveling for a move towards net zero emission vehicles. Now, in order to achieve this, it's very important that you talk to people within the company itself, but also to your customers. So you need to involve all stakeholders. And if you wanted to quantify what you're doing, so before we talked about carbon accounting, but you will need to implement something like that, and life cycle analysis is another example of that, where you can keep track of how much carbon you are emitting. Now, for the pharmaceutical industry, a lot of waste in actually their resources goes into clinical trials, as we know that not a lot of drugs are brought into the market. And until now, clinical trials have been largely ignored when it comes to carbon savings. So there are ways of measuring these greenhouse gas emissions during the clinical trials, with the idea is that for the new clinical trials that will be set up, that there will be an idea of how to better approach this. And in order to achieve all of this, as you can tell, because this is a very complex process, and if you really need to look at end-to-end solutions, you will need to use some digital tools and software in order to keep track of things. But obviously, if it would be easy to make carbon savings, then this would be widely implemented already. So there are some key challenges associated with these net zero initiatives, and the key one of them is probably the cost itself. Now, analysis by McKinsey has shown that healthcare systems they are responsible for around 10% in most industrialized nations for the national greenhouse emissions. So it is a very important topic to tackle. It's not just transportation or your diet. Healthcare systems are very important from a systematic perspective. But actually, when you look at healthcare systems, the most of the emissions are outside of the organization. So this is why I mentioned, for instance, that your procurement is very important to consider. It's not actually the processes itself. And in particular, we can see that 50% of that comes from the upstream part. So that means the purchased goods and the services that company used. So it means that you need to make conscious choices of who, for instance, which company will employ to do certain services, and also look at the raw materials and other goods that you buy. But important things here to consider are, for instance, alternative fuel sources, renewable energy sources, and techniques that you can buy in around carbon capture or storage. So if you're emitting, for instance, via your bioreactors, there are reactors nowadays which you can get in order to capture the carbon that you're working with. However, which is very important what they're saying, because a lot of people automatically think that these savings have got to be expensive. They say that readily around 60% of savings can be implemented with net zero costs. However, that is by 2040. So you do have to bear in mind that probably this will be a more long-term investment, and this might be putting off many companies as well. However, that still leaves around 40%. And these are the savings that will actually cost a lot more to the company, and for that reason might be less appealing. However, you've got to bear in mind in the years to come, a lot of these solutions will become cheaper as they are widely implemented. So look at, for instance, solar panels. The more you have of them, the cheaper it will be. And there's also a role for governments here, for instance, to reward these sustainable alternatives. Thanks for watching this video, and hopefully you've learned why net zero is very important in all aspects, but certainly also in the pharmaceutical industry. So we do have a full playlist on bioreactors, so do have a look there if you want to learn more about the topic.